عرفت أقف.
Hey, Erev Tov, everyone.
عرفت أقف.
Erev Tov. Okay, so my general rule is I don't punish the people who come on time. So let's get going. Our story today is the story of the Blood Libel, and in particular, we're going to focus on one particular period of the Blood Libel, but we're going to get started sort of in general with that. You'll forgive me if I'm a little distracted for the first minute or two because people are entering. I'm just managing the admissions. Okay, so
And if people could mute Rabbi, just for getting a lot of
I can do that. I can do
feedback.
that for
No,
everybody. Can get that done. Okay, very good. Okay, so here we are. We are at the story of the blood libel. So on to our next slide here. All right, the story of the blood libel actually starts in with the story of St. William of Norwich. And here is a 15th century woodcut made in Nuremberg. We'll actually see the Nuremberg plays a bit of a story here. Yeah, this is a city that has a deep history of anti-Semitism from the 15th century to the 20th century.
Fix the band pulls right now.
Um, the story of St. William of Norwich is very typical of the blood libel. In 1144, around Easter, there is a 12-year-old boy, an apprentice leather worker named William. And he disappears. And a few days later, on the Saturday, his mutilated body is found in the Thorpe Wood, which is just outside the city. And the body reportedly shows signs of torture. Now, the sheriff at the time refused to pursue the Jews because it was just a lack of evidence that Jews had anything to do with this at all. And so William of Norwich, sort of for the first um, 6 or 7 years after his death, is just a tragic accident. But then there is a monk, Thomas of Norwich, who initiates a cult around this, that he becomes Saint William of Norwich, and he suffered, and this becomes the source of the accusation against the Jews. And even his editor, Dr. Jessup of Norwich, called Thomas of Norwich, who the sort of people who are among the deceivers and those likely to be deceived. The story of William of Norwich is written maybe 30 years after he dies, but it becomes the basis around which all of the other stories of the blood libel are become founded. And this is just a sort of an excerpt from this monk, Thomas of Norwich, who says that the Jews bought a Christian child, the boy martyr William, before Easter and tortured him with all the tortures wherewith our Lord was tortured. And on Long Friday hanged him on a rod in hatred of our Lord. This idea becomes somewhat central to the idea of the blood libel. And the idea of the blood libel is that Jews have this need to murder the innocent. Of course, the Christian Savior was the original innocent, but they need to, on a renewed basis, find someone who is innocent to torture. And we're going to see that Easter and that the passion of Christ and the death of innocents are going to be central themes in the blood libel. And this is sort of how the blood libel propagates over different times. We have 1144 Norwich, England, 1168 Gloucester, England, 1161 the ritual murder accusation in Blois, France. This brings us to a new phenomenon. There is no body that is ever found in the ritual murder in Blois. The story of this particular ritual murder is that a tanner or a wagon driver lost his load, probably because the tanner's assistant was carrying hides, and tanned hides smell horrible. And he claims that the horses saw the dead body of a young Christian child, which of course the Jews must have murdered. There were 30 Jews who were burnt alive in a house on that day in Blois. So this marks a new low watershed, if you will, because you don't even have to produce a body to prove that the Jews killed their savior. And these go on in a number of different places: Saragossa, Spain; Lincoln, England; and the murder of Simon of Trent. Simon of Trent is another scenario where Simon of Trent went missing. No body was ever found, but of course the Jews were blamed. Now, this is the story of Simon of Trent, and the reason I bring up this particular one in greater detail is because it's going to lead us to a very important phenomenon that maybe really be the central crux of what we are talking about today. So in 1475, a 2-year-old boy named Simon disappeared from the city of Trent around the time of Easter. His father alleged that he had been kidnapped and murdered by the local Jewish community in order to make matzah for Passover. The entire Jewish community was arrested and forced to confess under torture before they were sentenced to death and burned at the stake. You can see here I have here a woodcut of the ritual torture of Simon of Trent. This becomes a very important part of the story because the ritual murder of Christian children by Jews is put into some learned texts. This particular depiction is an absolutely wretched, horrible depiction of Jews torturing Simon of Trent, and it is produced in this book, which was the Nuremberg Chronicle. The Nuremberg Chronicle is a comprehensive universal history chronicling the world from creation to the 1490s. And a brief outlook to the end of the world, the Last Judgment, as the 7 ages of the world. It's based on a Christian theology, and it is remarkable because it has several hundred woodcuts that are very well done, of which, unfortunately, this ritual murder of Simon of Trent is one of them. And it was compiled by Hartmann Schendel between 1440. Who lived between 1440 and 1514. He was a German physician, he was a humanist, he was an avid book collector, he lived in Nuremberg, and this was a bestseller of the day. There were 1,500 Latin copies, 1,000 German copies that were sold of this. It had 1,800 woodcut illustrations, 645 unique woodblocks by the artist Michael Wolgemuth. But what it does is you have this very popular text. Once you put things in print, you give them the imprimatur of being official, of being learned, of being true. There's something enduring about print. And now all of a sudden, of course, the story of the ritual murder of Simon of Trent is true. It's in the Nuremberg Chronicle. So Simon Dubnow is one of the great Jewish historians, says, and now we're moving from sort of the background of blood libel in general to specifically the Polish context. We have never seen in any other place a legal disease like in Poland in the short period between the 30s and the 50s of the 18th century. In this 20-year period, there was not a single Passover without a trial for a blood libel. Read those sentences. In this 20-year period, there was not a single Passover without a trial for a blood libel. In spite of the Pope's directive, the Pope had said the blood libel it's a farce. It's not true. The Jews don't practice this. There's no evidence of this. But nevertheless, in Poland, between the 30s and the 50s, there was a trial almost every year. There were 100 blood libel cases between 1547 and 1787. And in Podolia during the life of the Baal Shem Tov, which is the period we're talking about, there are 27 alone, just in Podolia, which is the southwest corner of Ukraine, the part that sort of abuts the Balkans and Hungary. That's Podolia, and you'll see that the numbers are just staggering. A good comparison, by the way, is witchcraft. There were also a lot of witchcraft trials during that time. Almost all the witchcraft trials involved women. I was tempted to put the Monty Python skit up here of the search for the Holy Grail, I think, and when King Arthur encounters a witch trial, because these trials are really farcical. but there are 1,500 witchcraft trials. There are 100 blood libel trials. But we're going to see that there's a vast difference between the way witchcraft is handled and blood libels are handled. The first and foremost, and maybe the most important one, goes back to this idea of writing books about it, making it a legal, making it a learned exercise, something that is the imprimatur of a trial. So many publications of the blood libel were put out, but there are very few for witchcraft trials. Blood libel testimonials were produced by the church itself. Again, almost all witches were women, all blood libel accused were men. And in Western Europe, it was townfolks, locals, and parish priests. But in Poland, it was often the bishops and the highest levels of the church. This particular church is the Diocese of Kamieniec-Podilski, which carries on one of the most famous of those trials, which we will see shortly. Part of the motivation here is the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is, you have Martin Luther, who publishes those 95 Theses, the printing press. The Protestant Reformation becomes a great threat to Central Europe and also to Poland. And the church becomes possessed with the need to do things better than the Protestants, to be more devout, more religious, better at converting Jews, better at getting rid of witches, getting better at all the things that good religious people should be good at. And at the same time, they are going to emphasize the passion of the Christ. And so this is a quote from, I'm sorry, my Polish pronunciation is horrible. So I found this article on blood libel accusation in Old Poland. And she tells us that the growth of the cult of suffering Christ bore great influence on the rise of accusations in which Jews were charged with repeating the passion. Representations of crucifixion became especially popular in iconography. Statues called the Lord's Passion were placed at the crossroads in the countryside, and the first cavalry, the stations of the cross, appeared in early 17th century, and people would start to make pilgrimages to these things. They would start to see them, and they started to become very riled up by the suffering of the Christian Savior. And that often led them to have great anger at those who they believed killed the Christian Savior, which of course, in their version of fact, is the Jews. It has nothing to do with the Romans. But the Jews are the ones who murdered the innocent. And as a result, this idea of the murder of innocents becomes something which is very, very salient in their mind. They become possessed with that. There's also another, and maybe perhaps a more pressing issue. There's widespread poverty and a monetary crisis in Poland. And part of what happens is you have Poland is not a place which is ruled by a central monarchy. It's got a very loose confederation of nobles, and rulers and mints resorted to debasing currency, right? They would take out some of the precious metal in it, and they would shave it down, and they would cover state expenditures, and they essentially debased their own currency. And they would then exchange them. They would need to use Western coins to buy things from the West, and then there were counterfeit coins that came in. There was at the same time also an invasion from Sweden and from the Ottoman Empire and other wars, and basically left Poland very, very poor. And as it turns out, Passover coincides with the spring thaw. Now, as you know, the Jews are often the money lenders of Poland. And in European society, Jews were allowed to they were pawnbrokers and money lenders. And so what would happen is, if in your town, everybody owed money to the Jews, or probably a group of Jews, and then all of a sudden Passover comes and the spring thaw, some child drowns in a lake, in a stream, which is then frozen over, and nobody knows where the child is, and then the child's missing since December or January. All of a sudden comes April, you have the spring thaw, and you find the body. It's like a lottery ticket. You can then take that, accuse the Jews, and confiscate their property. Now comes the Polish literary assassination, right? The blood libel treatises. So Here is the first one. I can't read the Polish, but it is produced by Jan Serafinovich, and its title translated would be Exposure of Jewish Infidelities and Rights Before God and the World. And what does this particular book say? So this actually is a book that was written by a Jew who converts to Christianity. And he was once the rabbi in Sluk and then in Brest-Litovsky, and he converted supposedly after reading Isaiah. Usually these were sort of narratives that are composed after the fact. And he's baptized on the 10th of April, and the crown prince and the countess are his godparents, and they're the ones who sponsor him to become a Christian. And very often, when you convert and become a Christian as a Jew, it's a great win for the church, and you're given a noble title. You can be a noble person. And so this particular accusation, because it is written by a rabbi, it was particularly dangerous. This was poison in the bloodstream of Polish anti-Semitism. So the Jews buy up all of the volumes on the first run of the printing, and they have them burned. But there are several copies and maybe some manuscript copies which circulated amongst the nobility and the clergy. So it's largely out of people's hands, but it's still perhaps in the hands of some people who are very dangerous. And one of the things that it says, one of the essences of the argument, there is a narrative in the Talmud in Gittin. The Talmud is dealing with the question of when Nebuzaradan is the general in charge of the Babylonian army, and he comes into the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, and he sees bubbling blood, and he's going to say, "What kind of blood is this?" And they say, "Oh no, it's nothing to see here. This is just the blood of sacrifices." So he says to them, "Okay, well, bring some sacrifices. Let me see." So they bring some sacrifices, but the blood does not bubble. And so he says, "Tell me really." And they say, "Well, this is the blood of Zechariah ben Yehoyada, who was murdered. He was stoned to death in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash on a Shabbat, which also was Yom Kippur, and he was a Kohen and a Navi, and there are all of these things, like 6 sins that happened at the same time. But essentially, you're murdering a prophet in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash. Can you imagine, it's like, God forbid, murdering the rabbi in shul on Yom Kippur, right? So Zechariah's the crime against Zechariah is unforgivable. So his blood sits there in the Beit HaMikdash and bubbles until Nebuzaradan comes. And Nebuzaradan kills scores and scores of people. And he said, and then he finally, I think the last people he kills, if I recall correctly, are the Pirchei Kahuna, the young priests. And the blood is still bubbling. And so Zechariah asks, Nebuzaradan asks, Zechariah, when will you be satisfied? And then the blood stops bubbling, and Nebuzaradan has this reflection. He says, if this is what happened after the killing of one person, what about me? Look how many people I've killed. And he immediately repents, and he converts to Judaism, according to the Talmud. The important part about that Talmudic story is that it involves blood and the satisfaction of the death of young, and so it has magic blood, and so therefore this is his Talmudic source to be used against the Jews. Now, any self-respecting Talmud scholar, any yeshiva student, anybody with a passing knowledge of Jewish ritual or Talmud knows that this is complete fiction. It is bovine scatology of the first order, but still it needs to be dispelled. And this leads to the only disputation that the Jews ever requested, the Vad Ha'arba Artzot, which means the Council of the Four Lands, which is the council that governs the Jewish governing council of Poland and Lithuania. They appeal to the Castellanes, I guess that's the Countess Elizabeta, his godmother, to hold a disputation against Serafinovich, and to refute his accusations. Interestingly, he did not show up to the dispute, and the Jews were issued an edict of exoneration. But you see already that the need to clear the air in print and an official method is set. I just want to sort of show you, and this is an incomplete list. It's an incomplete list of blood libel trials in Poland: 1680, 1683, 1689, 1694, 1697, all in Poland and Lithuania. Then San Morir's 1698, 1699. Again, I can't pronounce all of these places, but you can see 1705, 1706, 1713, 1710 in Lvov, right? Poznan, 1736 through 40. You get the picture. And again, this is an incomplete list. And then in Lvov, 1728, Poznan, 1736, Zaslav, 1747, Zitomir in 1753. And just want to pause on this one. This one, the 31 Jews are accused. They are the richest leaseholders. 6 of them are flayed alive and quartered. And I produced for you an image of being quartered alive, right? The remaining ones were acquitted. Some of the condemned accepted baptism, and their sentence was commuted to beheading. Meaning, the last thing before you die as a Jew, you say, okay, I'll agree to be baptized on this false charge of blood libel. And instead of being drawn and quartered, what I get out of my baptism is that they're going to kill me quickly with a beheading. And then there were 13 other Jews who were baptized. These trials were absolutely devastating to the Jewish community, and they were even more devastating because of the conversions that occasionally happened after them. Those conversions were absolutely demoralizing to the Jewish community. Also, it's important to understand various aspects of the blood libel. First of all, finding the body was like a lottery ticket. I mentioned that already. Christian trials had only prosecutors, no defense attorneys. And the only evidence was by confession. Now, in Christianity, you cannot draw blood against another Christian. That's the rule of the Inquisition. They probably use the same torture techniques. And you torture people until you get an acceptable confession. That's how you win a trial. You get them to confess. But in Poland, they write up these trials. And even after these fictitious trials, they're going to write them up. And once they're part of church record, people think, wow, this really must be true. This is a prayer that is written by Rabbi Yekutiel ben Yehuda Leib Gordon of Vilna. And he writes, Ribono shel olam, ma nishtaninu mikol umma v'lo, why are we so different from every different country in the world, right? Begalut aruch kazeh, this very long exile, asher lo nishma kamo ba'olam, no one's ever heard of such a horrible scenario. Va'am kol arichot hagalot hazeh, anachnu mekayimim kol haTorah im kol chumrot v'gzerot d'Rabbanan. We do all of the mitzvot and all of the stringencies and all of the rabbinic mitzvot. V'Yoshua lo nintzeit lanu, and there's no rescue for us. V'afal pikein anachnu mekayimim b'chozrim mekavim b'kiyuvim ein mispar. We hope with innumerable hopes. Alecha. They kill us with these strange methods, and we stand by many challenges, meaning the people who die under torture without confessing. And these many different false accusations that they place upon us, right? And he goes on and says, how many of us have been burnt because of these things? He says, and his last words are, Kuma liyasha amecha, liyasha mishichecha. Please rise up and save your people from this false accusation. I have to take a pause from the blood libel to tell you about, this is a twist in the Polish version of the story, and it's just an important piece of background. The class that I'm going to give Shabbat afternoon, after we finish the pre-fast meal, is going to be particularly about the Jewish dimension and this particular individual, Jacob Frank, who is a Sabbatean. And the Sabbateans were a perversion, but he's a perversion of a perversion. He's a perversion of Sabbateanism. And when I tell you he's a perversion, he would be a perversion today. The Frankists engaged in every manner of sexual immorality, and occasionally they did so in a way that other people would discover it purposefully. And this leads to an affair in Lancoron and this accusation against the Frankists for what they had done, this act of sexual immorality that was, I wouldn't call it public, but it certainly wasn't private. The Jews felt they had to take a stand, and it leads to a trial between the Talmudists and the Contra-Talmudists. We'll get to that in a second. But just to sort of show you this, the best map I could get you is this is Podolia, where that orange arrow is. And so you can see that it's north of Moldavia, and you can see that the Balkans are in there. So the Shabbatai Tzvi converts down here in Izmir, right here, Izmir in the rather Turkey Ottoman Empire, and the cult of Shabbatai Tzvi after his conversion to Islam sort of goes through this morphosis. It's called the Donme, which means the upside down, and they practice a very strange sort of version of Judaism, and then they migrate all the way up here, and once the Ottomans conquer here, so then you have Frankists and Sabbateans there. And one scholar of this particular period, her name is Rachel Elior. She's now a professor emeritus at Hebrew University. She said most families today can tell you whether they were a Hasidic family or an anti-Hasidic family. She says there were more Sabbatians in Poland than there ever were Hasidim. So that just tells us in somebody on this particular Call's Closet, there are some Sabbatians. And this was a particularly big problem. And this was this particular region. After the accusation, Jacob Frank runs away back to the Ottoman Empire, outside the clutches of the church. But he leaves behind him the need for hold on, I clicked the wrong thing. How do I? Oh. Okay, so this leads to a Talmudist anti-Talmudist debate. This is sort of playing into the hands of the church, because the church loved the Zohar and Kabbalah, because the Zohar has a system of 10 sfirot, and they thought that was a softer argument or a good gateway drug to the Trinity, because there are 10 sfirot, there are 10 different emanations of God, and they thought that was a good gateway drug to, even there were popes who even published the Zohar because they thought it was such an important element. And so this debate is set up as the Talmud versus anti-Talmudists. And the Bishop Mykolai Dembowski, he rules in favor of the anti-Talmudists. He rules in favor of the Frankists. He says the Jews are wrong and the Talmud needs to be burnt, and he rules that the rabbis should be flogged and the Jewish community should be fined and the Talmud should be burnt. But then he interestingly dies by a stroke on November 9th of 1757. Now, this is just a little bit of, it's a really remarkable little piece of the story. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who writes about this in his biography, which is called Megillat Sefer, he writes that it is a miracle greater than the one that happened in the times of Haman and Achashverosh. And he tells some very interesting stories. He says, well, there's one account that stated that the bishop, as he dies, sees Hebrew letters from the burning books with his eyes, and just before he dies, and he basically, leaves these instructions that the Talmud shouldn't be burnt and the priest should reverse it. And others say that there was a plague that erupted then in Kamenets, where that church was that I showed you before, and the bishop's ghost haunted all the priests who dug up his corpse and then cut off his head with a spade because this is what you do to a sorcerer, which must have been the reason that there was a plague. And it continued, and then even afterwards, and then the bishop shows up with his head under his arm. And I'm just, you'll forgive me for this. It's as if it's a Quentin Tarantino was writing Jewish history, right? Like this is sort of a piece of revenge fantasy that is going on here. But I doubt any of these things actually happened. But even Christian sources may have seen this, just going back a second. He orders the charge for the burning of the Talmud on October 17th, 1757. And by November 9th, right, scarcely 3 weeks later, he dies of a stroke. So that's, God playing justice a little bit. But nevertheless, Frank reemerges, right? And I showed you where he was on the map. It's just, the borders between them are quite the distance between these two areas is quite small. And this time he comes back and he says, look, we Frankists, we're really proto-Christians. And there are a whole series of things that they want to prove in a debate with the rabbis about the fact that really the Talmudists are wrong and the Frankists are right, and they're really much closer to Christianity, and that the Talmud really says that the Jews should accept Jesus as the Messiah, et cetera, et cetera. But the last of their charges is that the Talmud, the Jews need Christian blood, and this is derived from the Talmud, and anybody who is bound to the Talmud needs Christian blood. This time, since Bishop Dembowski had passed away, this is Bishop Soltych, first of Kiev and then of Krakow. And he was widely known to be corrupt. He had massive gambling debts, and once he had issued an edict on a blood libel accusation before, but he accepted 500 red ducats and sable worth 300 ducats in exchange for the release of the Jews. He was a big gambler, and he had huge gambling debts, things we don't really think about when we think about Polish priests. And he joins up with the Frankists to produce a brochure exposing the Talmud as an anti-Christian document. And these are the source texts that they use to prove that the Jewish need for Christian blood. And take careful note here. You need the Hebrew to understand how this works. It says, "V'charoset ya'aseh av zecher latit." You should make your charoset. This is from the Shulchan Aruch. This is from this is in the Ramah, the Ashkenazic voice of the Shulchan Aruch. It says the charoset, which we put on our Seder plate, you make it thick, a remembrance to the mortar. You put in a little bit of vinegar. O yain, and then how you pronounce the next word is very important. If you say it is yain adom, that means red wine, zecher ladam. That is how all Jews read it. Yain adom, zecher ladam. It is red wine, which is a remembrance of the blood of the plague of blood, the blood of the Jews during slavery. I don't know which blood it's a remembrance for, but it's a remembrance for one of those bloods. Maybe it's even a remembrance for the blood of the Egyptians that died, and we spill it out of the cup. All of those things, just fine. No problem there. Theologically, not for Jews, not for Christians. But the Frankists says, you don't read it Yain Adom. You read it Yain Edom. Edom is Rome. Rome is Christian. Edom is Christendom. What is the wine of Edom? Right? These are people who talk about the blood and the body. The wine is the blood, right? So this means these are synonyms for Christian blood. Any Jew reading this is going to say that is the most ridiculous reading. But when you put it into a trial, this is what Jews argue about. What's next? This one I find the weakest of all of them. In the Haggadah, after you spill all the wine, it says, Rabbi Yehuda haya notin bahem simanim. Rabbi Yehuda used to make of them signs. And the signs are Ditzach Adash Be'achav, which stands for Dam Tzvardei Akinim Arav Dever Shchin Barad Arbe Choshech Makat Becharot, which in English is blood, frogs, pestilence, wild animals. blood, frogs, lice, wild animals, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the slaying of the firstborn. That's what that means. Everybody knows what that's what means. Francis said, come along and say, it stands for Dam Tzrichim Kulanu Al Derech Sha'asu Ba'oto Ish Chachamim B'Yerushalayim. The blood we all need is like that which they did to Jesus by the wise men of Jerusalem. Right? It's an acronym. So they fill in whatever they want, right? So again, this is just another piece of their propaganda. Now they anticipated there was going to be a problem. Any Jew will tell you, right? What do we do to our meat? We salt it. Why do we salt it? Because you're not allowed to have blood in your meat. So we know blood is forbidden by scripture. In this slide, the dark is the Jewish version. The Frankists are in the red one. The Rambam says human blood is kosher. But they forget to tell you the context of where Rambam says human blood is kosher. Rambam says human blood is kosher because if you brush your teeth and your gums bleed, you're allowed to swallow. That's not called eating blood. That's the context of human blood is kosher. Not we can put it in our matzah. So you see again the sort of the arguments that they're up against. And this is there's a wonderful book, a very interesting book by a professor at I think he's both at Hebrew University and Johns Hopkins University, Pavel Machenko. He says the Frankists managed to present the blood accusation as an issue open to debate amongst experts in rabbinic literature. It was something about which the Jews themselves disagree. Even if the Frankists did not convince everyone present, they succeeded in placing the polemics on an entirely new level. You put it into a court trial, it seems like it must be true, or at least debatably true, or it's maybe it's not actionable, but this must be something that some Jews do, even if these Jews didn't do it. The use of institutions of prestige and printing create the imprimatur of authenticity and of truth. And it is we know, Rachel Elior says, Jews have been guilty of violating every single one of the 10 commandments. They have violated, don't use God's name falsely. They've violated the Shabbos. They've stolen. They've murdered. They've done all of these things. But the one thing Jews have never done is to ritually murder a child to bake their matzah with it. We all know that is as false gets. And yet the use of institutions and printing to give the image of something that was true is something which is part of the story of the blood libel. There were 3 tragic outcomes of this particular scenario: the burning of the Talmud, the public confirmation of the blood libel, and if you're with us on Shabbat, we're going to deal with this third one, the public conversion of the excommunicated followers of Shabtai Tzvi / Jacob Frank. But that's my teaser for the next episode. Now we're going to turn the page. We're going to turn the page by 350 years or so. And we're going to talk about modern institutions. So this is a cute cartoon about, if you look at who's like on the UN Human Rights Commission, it's like Pakistan and Cuba, places which are well known for human rights. So this, of course, says, okay, let's make it fast. I know most of us still have massacres and executions to attend today, but we need to condemn Israel. And Hillel Neuer, says that just last year, the UNGA stands for United Nations General Assembly resolutions. There are 18 against Israel and 7 against the rest of the world. And just to remind everyone, Russia is sending missiles into Kiev apartment buildings and maternity wards, right? So, and this was still during the days of Assad's Syria. And the only people doing anything wrong in the world is the state of Israel. Now, here is a very interesting sort of piece of this puzzle. This is Nawaf Salam is the ICJ president. And in their charter, it says that if for some special reason, you would presume conflict of interest, a member of the court considers that he should not take part in the decision of a particular case, he shall so inform the president. If the president considers that for some special reason one of the members of the court should not sit in a particular case, he shall give him notice accordingly. Well, you would think that if Mr. Salam had a conflict of interest against Israel, it should be perhaps declared instead of sitting as a judge with the appearance of impartiality. But the world is going to see him as impartial.
Largest prison in the world.
Okay, hold on a second. This is him talking about Gaza in 2008. It's important to note that this is 60 years after the 1948 war.
Can be described clearly and soundly as the largest prison in the world. Most of them, the majority of them, are the victims of the policy of displacement and expulsion, which coincided with the establishment of the State of Israel. Let's remember, Mr. President, that more than 2/3 of the population of the Gaza Strip, nearly 70% of the population of the Gaza Strip, are refugees who have no clear address in their own land except the refugee camps of Jabalia, Al-Shati, Al-Nusayrat, Dar al-Balah, Al-Maghazi, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and Brej. And all these addresses are targeted by Israel as the terrorist Jewish organizations, Haganah, Stern, and Argul, targeted their original addresses in southern Palestine with massacres and intimidation campaigns to force them to get out of Palestine. The duty of the international community to save the Gaza Strip and its population immediately from all forms of collective punishment that is imposed and perpetrated by Israel.
Okay, so, this is not, this man is not the vision of
addresses in southern Palestine.
This man is not the vision of impartiality, right? This is not someone we think sits. I mean, we could rehearse the arguments, and it's not necessary. But the idea that people who are the average age in Gaza is 18, so that means that people whose parents were even born after the displacement are still called refugees. The only place in the world where they're called that, labeling the Haganah, the Irgun, as terrorist organizations, and that they're targeted by terrorists, is clearly not someone who's going to sit in impartiality. And this is the president of the ICJ. Here's just another example of the same. Triumph of blatant racist and colonialist choices. Peace prospects vanish. Whole region in danger. Business as usual shouldn't go on. Right? So hashtag Israel. This is how he's describing Israel. This is not someone who is going to be the voice of impartiality. But yet he's the president of the court when South Africa lays its claim against Israel as committing a genocide. And so you don't need to win the case. You just need to lay the suggestion as this is what intelligent people debate about. And that is what's happening at the UN and the ICJ, that you're using these institutions of prestige, or at least supposed prestige, to be able to assassinate Israel in the international community. And so this is, just sharing with you a couple of opinion pieces from the Jerusalem Post. The ICJ damaged Israel's image and amplified terrorist voices because they put the Israel's defense minister and prime minister on the same platform as Yihya Sinwar. The claim against Israel for genocide lacked a sorry, I think I copied this wrong. It lacked strong. So you should say strong and verifiable legal basis. If you look at the definition of genocide, we all know that the Palestinian population grew. We all knew that Israel was in negotiations with Hamas to expand the number of workers, to expand the ability of the economic development of Gaza on October the 5th. And on October the 7th, the true nature of Hamas came out. The idea that there's some kind of equivalence between the two is something which is cast into balance by the use of these institutions of prestige. And just to be very, very, very current, this was Friday's New York Times, right? Now, the New York Times issued a retraction that this picture really wasn't a picture of a starving child. This is a picture of a child with a neuromuscular disease, but it's an assassination by suggestion. And we're seeing that, recognizing Palestinian statehood, it's funny because neither France nor Canada nor England will make a state out of them. And certainly they're not going to make any good governance there. But the idea of legitimizing them as a state is a very big deal. Yeah, okay. Yes, I'm being told in the chat that the retraction was issued by a secondary website. So yes, okay, even more the point. So the anyway, with that, I guess people want to questions, comments, thoughts, short speeches. Stephen, go ahead.
Hi, Rabbi. Wonderful talk, mesmerizing. I wanted just to inform just that